Sometimes a moment feels ordinary from the outside, yet inside it carries the weight of a lifetime. This was one of those moments, quiet at first, but heavy with memories that never really leave you. The lights of the premiere glowed warm against the night, reflecting off polished floors and expensive cameras. Reporters stood shoulder to shoulder, voices overlapping, names being called out. Keanu Reeves walked slowly along the line, dressed simply, almost disappearing among the noise meant to celebrate him. He smiled the way he always did, gentle and patient, stopping for each question as if time were not rushing him forward. When someone asked about his journey, the air shifted. It was not a sharp question or an invasive one. It was simple, almost kind. Yet it reached a place deep inside him that few people ever saw. For a brief second, Keanu did not answer. His eyes moved away from the lights, away from the crowd, as if he were looking through years rather than space. The journey they spoke of was not red carpets or applause. It was loss that arrived without warning, grief that settled quietly and stayed longer than expected. It was mornings where getting out of bed felt heavier than fame ever felt bright. It was learning to keep going when life took more than it gave back. In that pause, all of it surfaced, unfiltered and real. His voice softened when he finally spoke. He did not talk about success or numbers or achievements. He spoke about people who showed him kindness when he felt invisible. He spoke about resilience, not as strength, but as the simple act of continuing. As he spoke, his eyes filled not with sadness alone, but with gratitude mixed with pain, a combination that is hard to carry and harder to explain. The crowd grew quieter. Cameras kept rolling, but something had changed. This was no longer a celebrity answering a question. This was a human being standing in front of strangers, allowing them to see a truth he usually carried in silence. His hands trembled slightly, and he laughed softly, trying to steady himself, apologizing even for feeling so much. In that moment, it became clear why people connected to him beyond movies. It was not because he pretended to be strong. It was because he allowed himself to be honest. He stood there, vulnerable and composed at the same time, showing that humility does not erase pain, it simply learns to live beside it. As the reporters waited for him to continue, Keanu took a slow breath, gathering himself. What he was about to say next would reveal something far deeper than fame, something that would change how everyone listening understood his silence all these years. Keanu steadied his breath, but the feeling did not pass. It lingered in his chest, tight and familiar, like an old wound reminding him it was still there. He looked back at the reporters, not as faces with microphones, but as people waiting, unaware of how close he was to stepping away from the moment entirely. He spoke again, slower this time. He talked about how success can feel loud, yet loneliness can be even louder when the lights turn off. He admitted there were years when he questioned why he was still moving forward, years when grief shaped his days more than hope did. His words were careful, not dramatic, but every sentence carried weight because it was lived, not rehearsed. As he spoke, flashes of memory crossed his face. Loss had taught him humility in ways no award ever could. It stripped away ego and left behind something quieter and truer. He shared how kindness from strangers, small gestures, simple conversations had kept him grounded when everything else felt fragile. Not grand rescues, just human moments that reminded him he was not alone. The reporters listened more intently now. Some lowered their cameras without realizing it. The atmosphere felt intimate, almost private, as if the premiere had faded into the background. Keanu's voice trembled again, and this time he did not hide it. He allowed the emotion to exist without apology. He spoke about courage, not as fearlessness, but as the choice to stay open after pain. He said that closing your heart might protect you, but it also keeps you from feeling the love that still exists. His eyes glistened under the lights, and for a second he stopped speaking altogether, pressing his lips together to regain control. That pause said more than words ever could. It was the silence of someone standing at the edge of tears, choosing honesty over comfort. The crowd felt it. The moment was no longer about him alone, but about everyone who had ever carried quiet pain behind a polite smile. Keanu finally looked up again, meeting the eyes in front of him. There was something unresolved in his expression, something he had not yet said, something that had shaped his entire life. As he opened his mouth to continue, it became clear that the hardest part of his journey was still waiting to be spoken aloud. Keanu's gaze lingered on the crowd, but his thoughts drifted far from the premiere. He began speaking again, and this time his words came from a place deeper than memory. He spoke about the moments when life felt unbearably quiet, when there were no cameras, no scripts, no roles to step into. Just long nights and unanswered questions that echoed louder than applause ever could. He shared how grief does not arrive once and leave. It returns in waves, sometimes gentle, sometimes crushing, often without warning. There were days he felt strong and days he felt broken, and learning to accept both became part of his survival. He explained that resilience for him was not about overcoming pain, but about learning how to live honestly with it. As he spoke, his shoulders relaxed slightly, as if telling the truth lifted a weight he had carried for years. He talked about choosing kindness even when the world felt unfair, about offering patience when anger would have been easier. Those choices, he said, were not heroic. They were necessary. They were the only way he knew how to stay human in a life that often felt unreal. The reporters stood silent now, aware they were witnessing something rare. Keanu spoke of humility shaped by loss, of realizing that fame does not shield anyone from suffering. It only changes the shape of it. He admitted that there were moments he felt unworthy of the love people showed him, moments when he wondered if his quiet nature was misunderstood as distance. His voice faltered when he spoke about connection, about how healing often comes through listening, not speaking, through being present rather than being praised. He paused again, eyes glistening, and for a moment it seemed he might stop altogether. Instead, he nodded slightly, as if reminding himself why he had started. He looked back at the reporters with a calm intensity, the kind that comes after surrendering to truth. There was still one part of his journey he had not revealed, a realization that changed how he saw pain, love, and purpose itself. As he took another breath, it was clear that what came next would shift the meaning of everything he had said so far. Keanu paused again, longer this time, and no one rushed him. The premiere no longer felt like an event. It felt like a shared stillness, a space where time slowed out of respect. He seemed to realize that something had already changed. By speaking this openly, he had crossed a line he usually kept guarded, not because he feared judgment, but because some truths feel too heavy to place into words. When he continued, his voice was quieter, almost reflective, as if he were speaking more to himself than to the crowd. He began to talk about purpose, not as something grand or clearly defined, but as something discovered slowly, often through pain. He said there was a time when he believed purpose came from achievement, from becoming better, faster, more successful. Life had taught him otherwise. He spoke about moments when everything he had built seemed fragile, when roles ended, when applause faded, when the silence returned. In those moments, he said, he was forced to ask himself who he was without validation. It was a difficult question, one that did not have an immediate answer, and for a long time that uncertainty frightened him. Loss had a way of stripping things down. It removed illusions gently at first, then all at once. He shared how grief changed the way he looked at the world. Colors felt different. Time felt uneven. Days could stretch endlessly or disappear without warning. He learned that pain did not demand to be solved. It demanded to be acknowledged. As he spoke, his expression softened, as though he had finally made peace with something that once haunted him. He explained that resilience came not from fighting grief, but from allowing it space. From understanding that sorrow and love are deeply connected. You only grieve deeply because you loved deeply. That realization, he said, changed everything. The crowd listened as if each person were holding their breath. Keanu spoke about kindness as a choice he made daily, sometimes consciously, sometimes instinctively. Not because it made him feel noble, but because cruelty felt unbearable to add to an already heavy world. Kindness became his way of honoring those he had lost, a quiet promise to carry forward what mattered most. He admitted there were times he felt exhausted by his own empathy, times when being open hurt more than being closed off. But every time he considered retreating, he remembered the people who had shown him compassion when he felt most alone. Strangers who expected nothing in return. Simple gestures that arrived at exactly the right moment. He described courage in a way that surprised many. Courage, he said, was not standing strong in front of others. It was waking up on days when sorrow still lived in your chest and choosing not to harden your heart. It was allowing yourself to feel joy again without guilt. It was accepting that happiness does not erase grief, it simply learns to exist alongside it. His voice grew steadier as he spoke, not because the emotions had faded, but because he had settled into them. He talked about humility, about learning that no one walks alone, even when it feels that way. About realizing that asking for help is not weakness, and offering it does not require recognition. There was a moment when he smiled softly, almost sadly, as he mentioned how often people thanked him for being kind. He said he never quite knew how to respond, because kindness was not something he felt he owned. It was something he had been given, passed down through experiences, shaped by loss and shared forward. The premiere lights reflected in his eyes, but they no longer seemed harsh. They felt distant, secondary to the weight of the conversation unfolding. He spoke about time, how it changes the shape of pain but never fully removes it. How some days still surprised him with sudden waves of memory. But instead of resisting them, he learned to sit with them, to listen to what they carried. As he spoke, the emotional tension shifted. It was no longer raw grief that filled the air, but something steadier. Acceptance. Not resignation, but understanding. He acknowledged that his journey was still ongoing, that healing was not a destination he had reached, but a path he continued to walk. He said that the hardest lesson he learned was this: you cannot control what life takes from you, but you can choose what you give back. That choice, he said, became his anchor. When everything felt uncertain, choosing kindness grounded him. Choosing humility reminded him he was still learning. Choosing resilience allowed him to keep moving without denying what hurt. The reporters remained silent, some visibly moved, others struggling to maintain their professional distance. Keanu noticed this, and for a moment he seemed almost embarrassed by the impact of his words. He shifted his weight slightly, as if considering whether he had said too much. Then he added something unexpected. He said that vulnerability was not a performance. It was a responsibility. When you are seen by many, he believed it mattered how honestly you showed up. Not to overshare, but to remind people that they were not broken for feeling deeply. That statement lingered heavily. It reframed the entire moment. This was not a confession for attention. It was an offering, a quiet attempt to make space for others to feel less alone. As he finished speaking, there was no applause. No one rushed to fill the silence. It was too full already. Keanu took another breath, looking momentarily relieved yet contemplative. He had shared a truth that could not be taken back, and the weight of that truth now rested in the open. But there was still something unresolved. One final realization he had not yet shared. A turning point in his journey that reframed everything he had endured. As he glanced back toward the reporters, eyes steady but thoughtful, it became clear that the most defining moment of his story was still waiting to be revealed. Keanu stood quietly for a moment, as if measuring the distance between what he had already shared and what still remained unspoken. The noise of the premiere felt far away now, almost unreal, like a world continuing to move while this small circle stood still. When he finally spoke again, his voice carried a different weight, not heavier but clearer. He said there came a point in his life when he realized pain was not the enemy he had believed it to be. For years, he had tried to outrun it, manage it, minimize it. He thought healing meant reaching a place where it no longer hurt. But one day, quietly and without ceremony, that belief fell apart. Pain was not something to defeat, it was something to understand. He explained that this realization did not arrive during a dramatic moment. It came during an ordinary day, one with no cameras and no audience. He was alone, reflecting, and for the first time he allowed himself to ask a different question. Instead of asking why this happened to me, he asked what this has taught me about loving. That question changed everything. He began to see that grief existed because love had been real, that the depth of his pain reflected the depth of his connection. Instead of shrinking from that truth, he chose to honor it. He chose to let love remain visible in his life, even knowing the cost. He spoke about how this understanding reshaped his relationships. He became more intentional, more present. He listened more carefully, not just to words, but to silences. He stopped taking moments for granted. Even brief connections carried meaning now because he knew how fragile they could be. There were still days when sadness arrived unexpectedly. He did not deny that, but instead of resisting it, he learned to greet it with patience. He allowed himself to feel it fully, trusting that it would pass as it always did. This trust did not make him fearless. It made him grounded. He talked about courage again, but this time through the lens of vulnerability. He said the bravest thing he ever did was allow himself to love again without armor, to care deeply without guarantees, to accept that loss was not a sign of failure, but proof that something mattered. As he spoke, his eyes reflected both sorrow and warmth. He acknowledged that the world often teaches people to protect themselves by staying distant. But distance, he said, starves the heart. Connection feeds it, even when it hurts. Choosing connection was a risk he decided was worth taking. He shared how kindness became more than a value for him. It became a responsibility. When you understand pain, you recognize it in others. You see it behind frustration, behind silence, behind anger. Responding with kindness was his way of interrupting cycles of harm, even in small ways. He described moments when strangers opened up to him, sharing their own losses, their own struggles. He never felt burdened by those moments. He felt honored. They reminded him that pain creates a quiet bond between people who might otherwise never speak. Listening became an act of service. Humility, he said, came from recognizing that everyone carries a story you cannot see. Fame did not separate him from that truth. If anything, it reminded him how easily people are misunderstood. He made a conscious effort to meet others where they were without assumptions. There was a shift in his posture as he spoke now. He looked steadier, more settled. The emotional intensity remained, but it no longer felt raw. It felt integrated, as if grief had been woven into who he was rather than standing apart from him. He admitted that there were times he still questioned himself, times he wondered if he was doing enough, being enough. But he no longer measured his worth by perfection. He measured it by presence, by showing up honestly, even when he did not have answers. The reporters remained silent, fully engaged. Some of them were visibly emotional now, though they tried to remain composed. Keanu noticed, and his expression softened further. He reminded them gently that strength looks different on everyone and that it often appears quietly without recognition. He spoke about resilience as a long conversation with yourself, one that continues even when no one is listening. Resilience was choosing not to abandon yourself during difficult seasons. It was offering yourself the same compassion you would offer someone you loved. He reflected on how long it took him to learn that lesson. For years, he had been patient with others while being harsh with himself. Learning self-compassion was uncomfortable at first. It required him to sit with feelings he had avoided, but it also freed him from unrealistic expectations. As he spoke, the emotional arc of his story became clearer. This was not about surviving loss alone. It was about allowing loss to deepen his capacity for empathy. It was about becoming someone who could hold both joy and sorrow without rejecting either. He paused again, breathing slowly. The night air felt cooler now, brushing against the warmth of the lights. He looked around briefly, as if grounding himself in the present before continuing. He said that the most meaningful legacy anyone could leave was not success or recognition. It was how they treated people when no one was watching, how they showed up in moments that would never be remembered publicly. That belief guided his choices now more than any career milestone. There was still one final layer to his journey, one that tied everything together. A realization that gave direction to his kindness, courage, humility, and resilience. As he prepared to share it, there was a sense that the story was approaching its emotional center. He lifted his gaze again, calm and sincere. The words that followed would not be dramatic. They would be simple. But they would reveal why he stood there now, open and honest, willing to be seen not as an icon, but as a human being still learning how to live with grace. Keanu took one final breath, slow and deliberate, as if he understood that this moment would stay with him long after the night ended. When he spoke again, his voice carried a quiet certainty, the kind that comes only after long reflection. He said the final realization came when he stopped asking what his journey meant to others and started asking what it required of him. Not as an actor, not as a public figure, but as a person moving through the same fragile world as everyone else. He realized that everything he had endured was not meant to harden him, but to shape how he showed up for life. He explained that pain had taught him presence, loss had taught him patience, grief had taught him compassion. None of these lessons were chosen, but all of them were accepted. And acceptance, he said, was the moment suffering began to transform into purpose. He spoke about purpose not as a destination, but as a daily practice. Purpose lived in listening without distraction, in showing up even when he felt tired, in choosing kindness when it would be easier to stay silent. These choices did not erase the past, but they gave it meaning. He said he no longer believed life was meant to be understood completely. Some questions never find answers. Some wounds never fully close. But meaning, he learned, does not come from answers. It comes from how you carry what you cannot change. As he shared this, something settled in his expression. The emotion was still there, but it was no longer heavy. It felt grounded, calm, resolved. He spoke about learning to forgive life itself for being imperfect, to forgive fate for being unpredictable. That forgiveness allowed him to live more freely in the present. He acknowledged that he still felt fear sometimes, fear of loss, fear of uncertainty, but he no longer allowed fear to make decisions for him. He chose courage instead, not loud courage, but steady courage. The courage to remain open, the courage to care deeply, the courage to keep believing in people. He looked at the reporters then, truly looked at them and thanked them. Not for the attention, but for listening. He said moments like this reminded him that stories connect us. That vulnerability, when shared honestly, can become a bridge rather than a burden. The atmosphere felt lighter now, not because the emotion had faded, but because it had found its place. Some reporters smiled softly, others wiped their eyes discreetly. No one rushed to speak. They seemed to understand that the moment did not need to be filled. Keanu gave a small, humble nod, as if acknowledging something larger than himself. He said that if his journey meant anything, he hoped it reminded people that surviving hardship does not require becoming cold. That gentleness is not weakness. That kindness, especially after pain, is one of the strongest choices a person can make. He finished by saying that he was still learning, still healing, still walking forward one day at a time, and that was enough, not perfect, not complete, just honest. As he stepped away from the microphones and continued down the premiere line, the noise slowly returned. Cameras flashed again. Voices rose. But something lingered in the air, something quieter and deeper than celebration. For those who witnessed it, this was not just a moment at a premiere. It was a reminder that behind every journey lies a human heart, still feeling, still choosing, still finding meaning in simply moving forward with grace.